That was wonderful.
I begin with the biblical text. I am a theologian and an archaeologist. I've spent my career sort of on a dual track. So I begin with the biblical text. I take it as a serious historical document, along with Mesopotamian and Egyptian, ancient Canaanite literature. So I start with 1 Kings 6:1. It says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. So in other words, after 479 years, and they've entered into the 480th year. In the fourth year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, in the second month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. Fortunately, we have agreement across the board, which is very rare, that Solomon's temple was constructed at about 967. So if we take 967 and we add to it 479 years, that gives us 1446 BC for an exodus from Egypt, subtracting 40 years from that for wilderness wanderings. That puts us at 1406 for an entrance. In other words, that gives us the time frame for Joshua. Now, if you're taking that's the MT, the Masoretic text. If you're taking the Septuagint reading, it's slightly different. It says 440 instead of 480. And so if you took that, then you would be 1406 for the Exodus and 1366 for the beginning of the conquest. Either way, you're in the 15th century BC and the early 14th century BC, which is a far different thing than in the 13th century, which is where many modern scholars want to place the Exodus and the conquest. In this time frame, we have the Amarna tablets, and this is a series of correspondence from Canaanite city kings, city rulers, back to Pharaoh Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV. And it's a direct synchronism with Joshua's conquest. And so it's really fascinating. I've just published a new article on this, and you can see a bit about that in 5 Views on the Exodus. We synchronize with 1 Kings 6:1, Judges 11:26. This is the judge Jephthah, who's arguing with the Ammonite king, who's wanting to claim the Transjordan area, which has belonged to Israel for centuries at this point. And so Jephthah says to him, for 300 years, Israel occupied Heshbon, Aroer, the surrounding settlements, and all the towns along the Arnon. Why didn't you retake them during that time? Well, if we're dating Jephthah, which again, general agreement that Jephthah's around the year 1100, and we add 300 to that, that puts us at 1400 for a beginning of the conquest. So you see now we have two scriptural sources that are putting us at the same time. And so one of the things we say in archaeology, if you're looking in the wrong time, you're guaranteed to find the wrong stuff. So you'll be in the wrong level. So it's important that we get the chronology right. And I could give many examples, but I'll give you one more. This comes from First Chronicles 6:33 through 38. It's a genealogy. And you can see here you have the lineage. And so if the Exodus occurred in the mid-13th century, the average length of the 19 generations from Korah to Solomon would have been 15.2 years. Very improbable that the average Israelite male was siring his first male son at age 15. And especially since not all the ancestors of Heman would have been firstborn. So you see what you have here are 18 generations. An average length of a biblical generation is about 25 years, and everyone from Kenneth Kitchen to you name it, everyone's sort of, that's the number that's generally accepted. So 18 times 25 would be 450. And then you add another generation to get back to Solomon, because this gets you back to David. So you can see that Heman is one of David's worship leaders. Heman and Asaph are the worship leaders in the time of David. And then you get all the way down to the bottom and you're dealing with the worship leaders in the time of Moses. So you have a count of the generations. So 450 plus 25 equals 475. And then we add 967 to that, and that brings you to 1442 for the Exodus, which is almost identical to the date that you get from 1 Kings 6:1. So suffice it to say that we have strong biblical ways to date the Exodus and conquest, and we also have strong archaeological evidence. So the inscriptional evidence that I was going to share with you were three things: the Merneptah stela, the Soleb hieroglyph, and the Berlin pedestal. So actually what you're looking at, if you can see it, is the Berlin pedestal. And so this is a series of name rings that are on a pedestal relief in the Berlin Museum. And it actually has the name Israel. So this dates to the early 14th century BC, and it has the name of Israel as a conquered people group that existed. We have the exact same thing on the Soleb hieroglyph in Egypt, and it even mentions the name Yahweh with the three-letter spelling of Yahweh on the Soleb hieroglyph, the land of the Shasu of Yahu or Yahweh. So we know that by the time of Amenhotep III, there was already a land where people were worshiping Yahweh. Well, if you think about that, there's only one group of people in the ancient world who worship Yahweh. These were the Israelites or the Hebrews. So the Berlin pedestal, the Soleb hieroglyph, and then the Merneptah stela dates to the Merneptah is the son of Ramesses II, so it dates to about 1210. And he very clearly mentions Israel. He says Israel is conquered, his seed is no more. And this is very problematic for the late date of the Exodus, because if the Israelites are just arriving at that time, how are they already conquered by the Egyptians? So these are three important inscriptions. So Ami Mazar, a very senior archaeologist from Hebrew University, he writes, undoubtedly, the biblical story of the Battle of Jericho is legendary. In other words, it's only a legend. It's not actual history. Now, Ami Mazar is a friend of mine, and he's the more conservative variety of Israeli archaeologist. So if he's the conservative, imagine what the liberals are saying as far as the historicity and the reliability of Joshua. So we're talking about the story of Jericho. So let me run you real quickly through the Israelites' entry into the land. They camp at Shittim over here, Joshua 2:1, Joshua 3:1, Numbers 25:1. And Moses writes the book of Deuteronomy while they're at Shittim. This is the modern site of Tal el Hammam. And then Moses ascends Mount Nebo and dies. Joshua assumes leadership and takes them across the Jordan River, right by the waters of Nimrin. They have a miraculous crossing of the Jordan, just like the 40 years began with the miraculous parting of the Red Sea. The 40 years ends with the miraculous parting of the Jordan River. In other words, as I was with Moses, so I will be with Joshua. And incidentally, the baptism site that you visit today, either from the Jordanian side or the Israeli side, is at that exact spot. So John chooses that spot for the epicenter of his public ministry. So when he's baptizing at that spot, which the Bible calls Bethabara, the house of the crossing. So in other words, he chooses the place where this miracle, and it's the same spot that Elijah has parted the Jordan, the same spot that Elisha has parted the Jordan. It's the same spot that Elijah ascends into heaven. So when John chooses that spot, there's a lot of anticipation. And of course, it's at that spot that the heavens open again and a dove descends. Now, back on point, the Israelites come and they camp at Gilgal, and the males are circumcised. And after they heal, then they come to Jericho in chapter 6, and they have this miraculous victory at Jericho, which I just alluded to, and which scholars like Ami Mazar and many, many others would tell you is a teleological. It's a morality tale. It's not rooted in actual history. Now, as an archaeologist, of course, I can tell you that it is. You know, having spent decades excavating and studying these sites, they synchronize with the biblical text. And I'll share some of that with you. After the victory at Jericho, the Israelites go up into the hill country, probably following one of the wadis here, right up into the hill country to Ai, Ai. And Ai in Hebrew, of course, means ruin or destruction. And I spent 21 years excavating the site of Khirbet el Makatir or Makatir. finishing in 2016. Final publications are now out. And we believed that this met the biblical requirements for I. And what we found there was quite astonishing. And I'll show you just a bit of that in a minute. After Moses told the Israelites, when you come into the land and you gain a foothold, go north to Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal and renew covenant there. In other words, where the Abrahamic covenant was cut. So that's exactly what they do. So they head north, passing by Shiloh, and they go to ancient Shechem with Mount Gerizim on one side to pronounce the blessings, Mount Ebal on the other side to pronounce the curses. So this kind of gives you a visual overview of the sites in question here. So let's talk through them. This is John Garstang. He was the second excavator at Jericho. Selin and Watzinger, a German team, had excavated there in 1911 to 13. World War I brought an end to that excavation. Garstang came along just before World War II and did a quite extensive excavation. He was a good archaeologist, and he dated Jericho's destruction of City 4, massive destruction in City 4 at Jericho. Everyone agrees with that. To about 1400, which, as you can see from the chronology, fits nicely with the biblical text. He uncovered, among many things, a series of scarabs that show that it was occupied at that time. Tutmosis III, Hatshepsut, Amenhotep III. So you do have a what we would call late Bronze Age 1B, 2A horizon, or around 1400 occupation. This is Kathleen Kenyon. She was a student of Garstang's. Her father was the director of the British Museum, and using her dad's connections and money, she was able to do quite a bit. She earned a bachelor's degree in archaeology, but she was very skilled. I will give her credit for that. And some of the methodology we use today, we call the Kenyon-Wheeler method. But she went to Jericho, she said, unencumbered by the biblical text. In other words, I'm not taking the biblical text seriously. And she dated the destruction of Jericho City 4 to about 1550, not matching the biblical date. In other words, it was much too early for Joshua's conquest. So, of course, the media loved that. And just a few years later, when Callaway excavated what he thought was he was at the wrong spot. He announced to the world that there was nothing there. The site wasn't occupied at the time the Bible says that it was. So in the 1950s, you lost Jericho. In the 1960s, you lost And listen, if you lose Jericho and you've lost the conquest. You've lost the historicity of the Hebrew Bible. There are major problems with both of those excavations. This is some of the pottery. We fight about pottery a lot. I am a ceramicist. Personally, that means I'm an expert in ancient pottery, or as my wife would say, boring. But for me, it's not boring. This is some of the late Bronze Age 1B pottery that Garstang excavated. Again, clearly, this site was occupied at that time. And we also at Jericho have an eyewitness account. Joshua 6:20 says, the people shouted and the priests blew their trumpets. When the people heard the trumpets, they released a great shout and the wall fell flat and the people went up into the city. Very important little detail, like how would someone writing 1,000 years later, which is what the documentary hypothesis teaches, and sadly, most theological students, that's what they're taught. Next week, I'm going to be at Princeton. I've been invited to go to Princeton. And those students in Princeton, they're going to this Ivy League seminary, and they will all be taught the documentary hypothesis and why the Bible wasn't written until 1,000 years later and therefore is not reliable. Many problems with that. One of these, but to their credit, they invited me at least. When you get eyewitness details like this, that the people went up into the city. Here's a drawing of Kenyon. Now, Kenyon is the one who dated it to 1550. But look at her drawings. Pretend that the black and white at the top is not there. Those are Roman, Hellenistic Roman, and Byzantine remains. So in your mind, remove all the black and white. Just look at the color. Do you see the red? Can you read? Can you read what that says?
Fallen red bricks.
Fallen red bricks. Guess where they fell from? They fell from this wall right here. This revetment wall is still standing today. The walls of Jericho were not the stone walls. Those stone walls are still standing today. You can go visit them. It was the mud brick superstructure on top of it that collapsed. And when it collapsed outward, what did it create? A ramp. So when the walls of Jericho fell, they created a ramp. And what does the text say? They went up into the city. This is one of the pics when City 4 was excavated. You can see some of the mud bricks still clinging to the top of the revetment wall today. All this is now covered up and you cannot see it when you go visit there. There again, you see the stone wall, the revetment wall, and the mud brick superstructure on top of it, which is where Rahab's house, for example, would have been in that superstructure. You can picture the flax drying on the roof as you read in the Bible. One of the things that Garstang found and Kenyon found were these jars full of grain burned on the top. So dozens of these massive storage jars. If an enemy had conquered a city, this is long before no coins and no checks. Monetary value was found in commodity. And so what enemies would do is they would seize all of this commodity. They did not. Whoever conquered Jericho, they left it there and they were full to the top, which tells us that it was right after harvest. Well, the Bible tells us that it was right after harvest, of course, when the Israelites conquered Jericho. The city was burned. The Israelites only burned 3 cities, Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor, according to the book of Joshua. They did not want to burn these cities. This is their inheritance. They are about to inherit generational wealth, infrastructure, roads, bridges, aqueducts, walls, generational wealth. So they don't want to burn these. God told them, you're going to live in houses you didn't build. You're going to occupy cities you did not construct. Albright, who we call the father of biblical archaeology, in referring to the site of Ai, his hubris got the best of him. When a writer begins to refer to himself in third person, you know that he's a little full of himself. He writes, since the writer has scoured the district in question in all directions, hunting for ancient sites, he can attest the fact that there is no other possible candidate for Ai than Et Tel. Well, it turns out that a half a mile away, he missed it, was the small site. Et Tel is 4 times larger than Jericho. The Bible says that Ai was smaller than Jericho. So how could Et Tel have possibly been that site when it's 4 times bigger than Jericho? Here is our reconstruction drawing of our fortress at Khirbet el-Makadr, what I believe is the likely candidate of biblical Ai. It's only about 2.5 acres in size. And again, this fits very nicely with the biblical account. To orient you again on our map, they cross over from Shittim, camp at Gilgal, they have victory at Jericho, they go up into the hill country, they have victory at Ai before then going north to Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, and then carrying on the rest of the conquest that you're going to be studying as you study Joshua. So in our excavation at Khirbet el-Makadr, there were 6 topographical requirements that we were looking at, along with a series of archaeological requirements. And so we were looking to check those off. If for example, if the gate was not on the north, or if there wasn't a hill to the north of the site, then it was the wrong side. Because the Bible says there was a hill to the north of Ai, and there's no hill there, then we're in the wrong side. So over the years, we were able to check off each one of these as they met the biblical requirements. You can see my map of that immediate region. Here is Et Tel, where Callaway thought was Ai, where he said there was nothing there and no one there, and Albright said there's no other candidate. Here is half a mile away, Khirbet el-Makadr, where we did find all of the evidence that matched the biblical account. This is modern Highway 60 running through Judea, Samaria, what some call the West Bank. Here's the ancient patriarchs highway, so it just diverges slightly from that. Bethin, the likely site of Bethaven, mentioned in Joshua 7. Elbira, the likely site of Bethel, mentioned throughout the book of Joshua, throughout Genesis as well. Jacob's ladder. I spent 365 days of my life working here and looking across at Bethel and looking down at the Dead Sea and thinking about this biblical geography and chronology. And so I think I've got a pretty good grasp in my mind of how it played out. Here is what the region looks like. This is called the Wadi Shiban. And this is where I believe the ambush force was probably hid to the west of the site. And it's not visible from Bethel, but they could reach Kermit El Makader, in about 5 minutes. And I know because I dropped off a team down there and then had to time them to see how long it would take them carrying their gear. It was just a little over 5 minutes. But this is the hill, what we would call the Bethel Hills, north of Jerusalem. Here are the archaeological requirements we were looking for. We did find evidence of destruction by fire. We did find the gate on the north side. If it had been on the south or the east or the west, I would have just said it's still an important excavation and helps us understand biblical times, but it can't be because the Bible says the gate was on the north and it's not, but it was on the north. So this is an example of how we do archaeology, working with a criterial screen. Here's one of the drawings of the fortress. Some of our late Bronze Age pottery from the time of Joshua, which for us, this is a big deal. We fight about this stuff. You have to accurately date the pottery if you're going to date the stratum and people not question your results. And so you can see the gate complex here, some of the finds, including a scarab I'll show you in a second that came from right here. And this was voted the #1 find in Israel in the year 2013, this scarab. It is the scarab of Amenhotep II, who is the likely pharaoh of the Exodus. And when we found it in a clean archaeological context just above bedrock, the pottery with it, because this is very datable, it confirmed that we were right on the dating of the pottery. There were people saying, Stripling and Wood and those guys, they're just trying to prove the Bible, Well, this proved that we weren't just trying to prove the Bible, but that we indeed had been dating the pottery correctly all along. This shows you your basic timeline again. The most powerful of all the pharaohs, Tutmosis III, who's the pharaoh of the oppression, puts the Israelites into slavery. Amenhotep II is the pharaoh of the Exodus, and Amenhotep III is the one I was talking about earlier with the Soleb hieroglyph and the Amarna letters being written during his reign. Then you can see the basic timeline here. And I will, Debbie, send you this PowerPoint so you guys can have it.
Okay, thank you.
Larry Stager was the dean at Harvard for many decades. He lived into his mid-90s. He's since deceased. When confronted with what Adam Zertal had found on Mount Ebal in 1980, which Zertal was an agnostic, had never even read the Bible, as a matter of fact. He was in charge of the Manasseh Hill Country Survey. And can you imagine surveying and excavating biblical sites and you've never read the Bible? But he became a believer in what he found on Mount Ebal. And Stager's response to that was, if there is an altar on Mount Ebal, as Zertal claims, we biblical scholars and archaeologists should all go back to kindergarten. And so, Larry's real clever. Of course, class is now in session because there is an altar on Mount Ebal. And you may have heard about our archaeological work on Mount Ebal, which further confirms this. But let's take a quick look. Here is what Zertal found. It was a biblical altar. This is in the heart of Manasseh on Mount Ebal and Joshua 8. So you get the defeat at Ai in Joshua 7. You get victory at Ai in Joshua 8. And then they immediately at the end of chapter 8 go north and they renew the Abrahamic covenant. So pronouncing blessings from Mount Gerizim and curses from Mount Ebal. Joshua 8:30 says that Joshua then built an altar to the Lord on Mount Ebal. This altar, this rectangular altar with a ramp on the west, is from the 13th century BC. Underneath it, right here at the perfect geometric center, is a smaller round altar, which Zertal believed, and I believe, well, he called it the primogenial ritual site on Mount Ebal. In other words, Joshua's altar, if you're speaking biblical terms. So in the Judges period, they venerated, they protected the earlier altar, which was found underneath it. So we'll just take a look as this spins around. It's inside a huge foot-shaped enclosure the size of 4 football fields, and inside that is a smaller enclosure the size of 1 football field. You can see it's excuse me. It's just as it was in biblical times. Unencumbered. Here I am. My left foot is on top of that round altar, which has been recovered since then. We did a project in December 2019. We could not excavate because it's an Area B, the most sensitive area of the so-called West Bank, but we were able to do a special project. We have perfected the technology of wet sifting, and so I was able to obtain permission to take Zertal's dump piles, his garbage that he left behind, and to take it to a nearby site where we processed it with our new technology. And we found that although Zertal was a good archaeologist, we found that he had missed something very important. Here we are in our project. And I will, since I'm going to send you the video, the PowerPoint, you can watch the video on your own, but it just gives you a flavor for the project and how it was carried out. But I'll move on through since we only have a few minutes. Just to remind you that Moses had told them what to do when they came into the promised land. They were going to go to Mount Ebal. They were going to build an altar there. They were going to cover it and so forth. And then Joshua 8 says that that's what Joshua did. So Moses told him to do it. Joshua did it. Archaeology found it. Welcome to biblical archaeology. This is modern Nablus, named after Neapolis, the city of Herod, Neapolis. Mount Gerizim, where 6 of the tribes stood to pronounce blessings. Mount Ebal, where 6 of the tribes stood to pronounce curses. The Levites and the Ark of the Covenant were in the middle. This is a drawing that the Armstrong Institute did showing that small round altar at the perfect geometric center. The tablet that I'm about to show you derived from that small altar, which dates all the way back to, Zertal had it dated to the mid-13th century, but I have strong reason to believe, and as I have published and as I will briefly show you, that it actually dated back to about 1400 BC. I do agree with him on the date of the larger altar. On these foot-shaped enclosures, I was going to say one other thing before my throat went out on me. Zertal found 6 of these foot-shaped enclosures coming up the Jordan Valley. And nobody can explain these, and they're hard to date, but this is the 6th one. The last one is on Mount Ebal, where Joshua's altar is. Maybe it's reminiscent of the Abrahamic covenant. Wherever your feet touch, I will give you. But explain it any way you want. We've got a series of foot-shaped enclosures coming from Jericho up the Jordan Valley and ending here on Mount Ebal. So one of my students, Abigail Levitt, her drawing of this, she's now doing her PhD at Ariel University in Israel on this topic. This is the small lead tablet, which we recovered from wet sifting. This has been called everything from the greatest archaeological discovery of the last 100 years to a fake and a phony and So lots of opinions. We have a saying where there are two archaeologists, there are three opinions. Here, it is a small folded lead tablet, and we recovered from the inside of this using tomographic scanning ancient text, and it's what we believed was a proto-alphabetic script. And here's what the letters, for example, look like. You can see the che, and this was like the word hallelujah, this would be the H sound in ancient Hebrew. So this is older than Paleo Hebrew, which is what the Bible is written in. This is the precursor of that, the proto-alphabetic Hebrew, what's usually called Proto-Canaanite or Proto-Sinaitic. No one has the guts to call it Proto-Hebrew, which is what it actually is. But over an 18-month process studying these tomographic scans from Prague, because we could not open the tablets, so this is why we had to use tomography. Long story short, I have published this. You can get my articles easily off my academia.edu page, but this is what I believe that it says, or something similar to this. I was very clear from the beginning that we're not certain, because that ancient script can be read forward or backward or top to bottom. And so it can be read different ways, but to the best of our ability, this is what we think it says. We're sure that it has the name Yahweh or Yahoo, and we're sure that it has the word arur or cursed. The rest of it, this is to the best of my ability. What I think it says something like this: you're cursed by the God Yahweh, cursed. You will die cursed, cursed you will surely die, cursed you are by Yahweh, cursed. So it's real encouraging, isn't it? But of course, Mount Ebal was the mountain of the curse. And I believe this was the summary of those curses that you read about in Deuteronomy 28 and 29, and that it was self-imprecatory. This was a curse that they were bringing upon themselves if we do not keep God's law. Of course, it was laid upon the altar and covered with blood. So those who did not keep the law but would repent, of course, the curses did not inure to them. If I am right, this is the oldest Hebrew writing ever found, and certainly the oldest in Israel, the oldest mention of God's covenant name. We do have Yahweh mentioned at the Sol of Hieroglyph. We have it at not Sedabet El Hadim, but it's on the tip of my tongue, the Sinai site where you have the famous Yahweh and his Ashada inscription from there. This is a close-up look at the covenant name of God, Yod He Vav, the three-letter spelling. And you have the two-letter, the three-letter, the four-letter spelling in the Bible itself. Later, it became standardized with what we call the tetragrammaton, or the four-letter spelling. Joshua 18:1 says that the whole assembly of the Israelites gathered and set up the tent of meeting at Shiloh. The country was brought under their control. You may know that I am excavating Shiloh since 2016. I'm about to return for another season of excavation. So this is the final site of the conquest. So from Shittim, the first site, to Shiloh, the final site, I've had the privilege of excavating at both of those and several sites in between. We have found what we believe is the gate of Shiloh. On the outside, on the north, an outer gate and an inner gate. We'll be doing further work on that this summer. You can see some of the piers from that. This was under maybe 15 meters of debris that we excavated to get down to this level, and lo and behold, we got into the sweet spot of what was there in biblical times. In our area D, we have a massive fabisa, which is a bone deposit, about 100,000 bones from the biblical sacrificial system at Shiloh. So remember, when Jerusalem was still a pagan city for 300 more years, if you wanted to connect with God, you came to Shiloh. And so due east of our monumental building, which matches the dimensions of the tabernacle, you come to this massive bone deposit. Kosher bones, young animals, disproportionately from the right side, not from the left side of the animal, which Deuteronomy 7 says the right side of the animal is the priest portion. And so this area right here is another one of our main focuses. So the the gate area, the favisa, and then third is the monumental building. And we have 4 or 5 more seasons of work to do on this, and then we'll be able to announce this and publish it. And the world, I think, will be pretty excited. Leviticus 17:11 says, "Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin." And so, as we process through these just countless animal bones with pottery from the time of Joshua, I do carbon dating on the bones. I do DNA testing on the bones. And so we want to understand everything we can, because we won't get another shot to go back and collect this data. Here's our reconstruction drawings. We've got walls going every which way, and sort of the world's biggest jigsaw puzzle. If that's appealing to you, you really should come with me to Shiloh, because it's an incredible jigsaw puzzle. And the Zevayim, which is of course part of the Mishnah, says that there was a stone building that replaced the tabernacle at Shiloh with a tent over it. So it's kind of a quasi tent tabernacle. And here are some of the pottery vessels as they come out of the ground from that time period. These are the Israelite collared rim jars, and the storage rooms are full of them, where they would store the tithes for this building here, which matches the dimensions of we now have. This other wall here matches the biblical dimensions of the tabernacle. The biblical text itself suggests that a permanent structure was built there. Go back and read 1 Samuel 3, and you're no longer talking about the tent and the curtains and so forth. You're talking about the doors of the tabernacle and the walls of the tabernacle. And it's called the house of God and the temple of God. It's not called a tabernacle anymore, but the temple of God. So it appears that that is what we are excavating, is the very platform. If so, then this is the area of the Holy of Holies. This is the area of the holy place out here. These storerooms are where the tithes were stored. The favisa, the bone deposit, is over here, and the gate is right in this area. Now, I did not know that when I chose this area for our excavation at Shiloh. I could have worked for decades and not come across this, but perhaps providentially, when I chose this area, that's where the sweet spot was. I was on record. I'd already published an article saying I believe that the tabernacle would have been on the top of the tell. Well, obviously I was wrong, and it wasn't. We've excavated ceramic pomegranates from this building. The pomegranate is a motif of the tabernacle. And on the hem of the priest's garments, you had bells and pomegranates alternating. So you see the little hook here. I cannot, and I have published this academically, you can easily find that. I cannot prove to you that hung from Eli's robe, but I can't say that it didn't. The Bible says that there were priests there who had pomegranates hanging from the robes. And what are we finding? Miniature pomegranates. We are also finding altar horns. We have a demolished 4-horned altar. We also have scarabs from that time period. Well, blessings. I'll look forward to talking with you soon.